Today we are continuing to read Hunting for Hidden Gold by Franklin W. Dixon. When we last left the Hardys, Frank had lost Joe in the snow. Chapter 18, North from Lone Tree. For a moment Frank was panic-stricken. He shouted Joe's name, but the howling wind drowned his voice. Snugging his chin inside his turned-up coat collar, Frank slouched in his saddle and waited. Minutes dragged by. Again and again he called his brother's name, but no answering cry reached his ears. Darkness was closing in rapidly now, and Frank was half numbed by the icy blast of the storm. His heart sank with every passing moment. It's hopeless, Frank decided at last. If I sit here much longer, I'll freeze. I must get out of the driving wind and snow. Frank urged his horse in the general direction of the mountainside. Presently, through the swirling snow, a shapeless, rocky mass loomed in front of him. Frank guided his horse along the base of the rock, and after several minutes of plodding, found a spot that was partially sheltered by overhang. He dismounted and drew his horse in out of the blizzard. Frank clicked on his flashlight and shone it in the area. Fringing the rock face were brownish clumps of brush, dry and brittle beneath their coating of snow. "These'll do for a fire," thought Frank, and it might signal Joe. He broke off enough of the brush to make a small pile and took out his waterproof case of matches. He struck one, then a second. Both blew out. But the third one caught. Cupping the flame in his hand, Frank held it against one of the broken twigs. In a moment, the dry wood began to smolder. Bit by bit, Frank nursed the ember into a fire, and soon enough had a roaring blaze going. It won't last long, though, he reflected as he warmed his hands and face. By now, the circle of firelight was strong enough to reveal a fallen tree several yards away. Frank managed to break off some branches and brought them back to augment his supply of firewood. If only Joe were here, he thought. Shivering, Frank walked out into the darkness. "Joe!" he shouted, his voice straining. Then again, "Joe!" Frank listened intently. Suddenly, his heart leaped. He had heard a cry. Frank began yelling frantically. Several moments later, a horse and rider took shape out of the snowy darkness. Frank rushed to meet them and guided Joe's frost-rimmed mount back towards the welcome glow of the firelight. Joe himself was white from head to foot. He climbed wearily out of the saddle, shook himself off, and hunkered down close to the flames while Frank attended to his horse. "Whew!" Joe gave a long sigh of relief as the warmth of the blaze restored his numbed circulation. "Good thing you built this fire, Frank. I was about ready to give up." "I was hoping you might spot the light," Frank said. How did we get separated?" "My carelessness," Joe confessed. "I was looking around for signs of Big Al and sort of trusting my horse to follow yours, and first thing I knew, you were nowhere in sight." The boys blanketed and fed their horses, then opened a can of beans and had a warm supper. "I wonder if Big Al's lost in the storm too," Joe mused drowsily. "Probably," Frank replied. "If he's smart, he'll find some kind of shelter." "He may have already found the mine tunnel where Dawson's gold is hidden," Joe pointed out. "Let's hope not." There was a long silence as the two brothers crouched close to the fire, listening to the roar of the storm. Gradually, their heads drooped. It was an uneasy, uncomfortable night. Frank and Joe managed to sleep on and off, but as the fire died down, one or the other would have to get up and forage for more wood. With the first clear light of dawn, the brothers were awake and preparing to hit the trail. The snow had stopped sometime during the early morning. Now the whole valley lay covered in a ghostly blanket of white. "What's our next move?" Joe asked. The boys were eating breakfast. "I think our best bet is to look for the lost plane," Frank suggested. "The mine tunnel can't be too far from that." Joe shook his head pessimistically. "Don't forget, Big Al's gang has been looking for it for a long time with no luck." "But they had nothing to go on," Frank argued. "Of course Dawson's plane fell into a gully, so it might not be too easy to spot." "That's true," Joe said thoughtfully. "Let's see if we can get some idea where it came down. According to Dawson, he headed north and was in the air only 3 or 4 minutes. The Hardys made a rough calculation. Based on the probable speed of a single-engine plane of old vintage, and then using their compass and taking a bearing on the lone sentinel pine atop the ridge, they started off towards the area where they estimated the crash may have occurred. The horses could only move at a slow plod. Their forelegs sank knee-deep in the snow at every step. Frank and Joe, their breaths steaming in the sub-zero atmosphere, were forced to control their impatience. The search continued for several hours. By late morning, both boys were discouraged. Joe, who was in the lead, reined in his horse. "Seems pretty hopeless, if you ask me," he said, swinging around in the saddle. "Maybe we should just—" Joe broke off with a gasp. As he turned, his eyes had suddenly detected something protruding from the snow in the distance. "Frank!" Joe pointed off through the clear, cold air. Frank's eyes widened as he, too, saw the object. "You're right! Let's go check." Turning their horses, the boys rode towards the spot. Before they even reached it, they could make out the skeletal wingtip of a plane sticking up from the snow-choked gully. "That's the wreck, all right!" Frank exclaimed jubilantly. "No wonder Big Al and his gang never saw it. Those trees along the edge of the gully would have screened it from the ridge." The boys halted to discuss their next step in the search. "The mine tunnel must be somewhere in the mountainside," Frank reasoned. "And it must be on this side of the valley. The other side's miles away, and Dawson couldn't have carried the gold that far." "Still gives us a lot of ground to cover," Joe said. The two boys rode toward the edge of the valley, where the ground began to slope steeply upward. "Dawson probably wasn't in any shape to climb very far after the crash," Frank said, "so let's concentrate on the lower slopes." The boys decided to turn left and skirt the mountainside for at least 2 miles. If their efforts proved fruitless, they would then retrace their steps and try the other direction. Deep drifts and tangled underbrush made the going difficult. Several times the Hardys were disappointed. What looked like a hole in the mountainside proved only to be a shadow of trees or some rocky outcropping. But then, suddenly, Frank gave a cry of excitement and pointed. "There's the opening for sure, Joe." The dark recess was only partly screened by a clump of underbrush. The two boys dismounted, ground-hitched their horses, and scrambled up the slope. They pulled aside the snow-laden brush, and Frank shone his flashlight in the hole. As the yellow beam stabbed through the darkness, Joe murmured, "Looks more like an ordinary cave than a mine tunnel." "But there is a tunnel back there," Frank replied. In the rear wall of the cavern, about 50 or more feet from the entrance, they could make out another hole which evidently led deep in the mountainside. "Okay, let's take a look," Joe urged. The boys entered the cave cautiously and walked toward the inner passage. Frank stopped as he heard a faint rustling noise to their left. "Hold it, Joe." His brother turned quickly. A pair of glowing eyes glinted at them from the darkness. Frank's flashlight revealed an enormous gray wolf. Standing stiffly, the animal glared at the intruders, baring his teeth in a low growl. Other noises reached the boys' ears. Frank swung his flashlight around, and a dozen pair of wolf's eyes shone in the darkness, glowing like burning coals. "Good grief!" Frank's voice was hoarse in a whisper. "We've walked straight into the den of wolves."